So ladies, gentlemen, fellow Kryptonians out there, welcome back to a brand new Superman and Lois recap, review, and breakdown. So this is for episode 8, and we've only got 2 more episodes left for the entire series, which is mental to say. I've been here too many times before with other series saying this kind of thing at this point in the reviews, but I really don't want Superman and Lois to go. But this episode finally saw Luthor coming back, and not only that, in a bit of a different look. I mean, the episode title, after all, is Sharply Dressed Man, and my goodness, that certainly was the case. I also want to say at the beginning here, stick around for the penultimate episode promo/trailer breakdown at the very end, because I love getting into a little bit of theories with what could be happening next episode. But let's just get right into this. So in the aftermath of last episode, with Clark revealing himself as Superman to the whole world, we pick back up again with Luthor gearing up for the next stage of his plan, with Amanda telling him that the board is excited that Luthor has agreed to do an interview, as they think it will go a long way towards public perception, driving the stock prices up. But, you know, as we know, that's not really the reason why Luthor is doing it, nor does he particularly care about that. He's doing this to just simply further his plan to dismantle Lois Lane through, this time, attacking her publicly and her reputation. And as this scene closes, we get a great shot of Lex getting suited, and he's finally shaved, and Michael Cudlitz has finally got the classic Lex Luthor look. Now, this kind of reminds me of a comic book that I've been recently reading due to being an influence on James Gunn's Superman, thanks to Nicholas Hoult dropping that detail. But Luthor, Man of Steel. I'm probably showing the image there. I'm not saying it's exactly alike, but, you know, Michael Cudlitz was giving me those vibes. Now, back at the Kent farm, we get a little brief teaser of the new life that Superman is living, or, you know, rather, I would say, having to put up with at this moment. And that's with the reference to General Hardcastle, as Lois is saying that she's trying to keep the looky-loos away. So it does seem that around the Kent farm, there's a bit of a military/DOD presence to usher people away if they get, I guess, a bit too trespassy to see where the Superman lives. Also in this episode, we somewhat wrap up the threads of Lois's season 3 cancer storyline, as she has a scan to determine whether she still has it or not. And when we follow those scenes, just as I do here to connect it all together, she finds out that she is completely done with her treatments. And in this moment, just as Lois was on a high, was wanting to celebrate the news, she hears Lex's voice on the TV at the hospital doing his interview about Lois Lane on none other than the Gordon Godfrey show, and Gordon Godfrey is Tom Cavanaugh. So no, it turns out that he wasn't the Milton Fine Brainiac, which a lot of people were theorizing, myself included, but rather some kind of trash TV reporter/host or whatever, which I think he played brilliantly. However, we do learn a lot more, finally, about Milton Fine a little bit later on, which we will get to. So initially with this interview, Gordon Godfrey just pokes for more details from Luthor, and it's like a very biased message and a biased show with what's being put out, with him emphasizing and reiterating again and again that it was 17 years for a crime that Lex didn't commit. And you just know that Lex has probably paid this guy like a bunch of money to really push that message out there. And then the initial part of the interview ends with the question, what is it you hope to get from Lois Lane? And Luthor replies, the truth. Lois Lane claims to be a champion for justice. If she really believes that, then I challenge her to come on here and debate me face to face. And so that starts the public war between Luthor and Lois. Now, after this, we go back to Lois and Clark just kind of going over everything that just happened. And Lois, being Lois, is completely down to confront Lex on camera, since, as we know, she's incredibly capable to do so. But throughout this episode, Clark is very hesitant, as, I mean, I think everyone can agree, it's blatantly a trap. I mean, Lois knows this as well, but the thing for her is that her reputation is at stake if she doesn't appear on the interview, or the debate rather, and it doesn't exactly look great if she doesn't turn up, right? A lot of people would just come to their own conclusions. Now, Clark goes on to even detail this with how Otis Grisham is the only real witness with any information on Luthor, and so perhaps the game is that if Lex discredits her publicly, he can already kind of plant that doubt ahead of Otis's testimony, which might not make it too effective in the future for whatever Luthor may have had to deal with, like with a jury or something like that. And at this point as well, Luthor, as Clark says, probably doesn't have any moves left. So he is pretty desperate at this point, considering his plan with Doomsday failed, the Luthor Corp business move to Smallville didn't work out, but also in this episode, look who's back, John Henry Irons and Natalie. Initially, we see them working on some schematics to build weapons for the DoD, with Natalie feeling like they're working a lot. She's skipping out on seeing Mateo, or even things like going to see a movie with John and Jordan, and so they kind of tease in this moment that she might be having second thoughts on her decision to do this, but by the end of the episode, as she says herself, it seems for people like us, when you're kind of in this life, you're in it. This is when we have Natalie and John Henry Irons both fly to this accident to save this guy from the car, and this man turned out to be Milton Fine. And again, more on this in a little bit because I've got quite a bit to say there. Now, continuing along, John Henry goes to Lois and Clark and tells them, surprise, surprise, that Otis was found hanging in his cell. And, you know, there was no way that Lex was going to let him dish the dirt on him. This is when we get someone sent by Luthor to throw a brick through the Gazette window. And right as it was about to hit Lois, Clark saves her. And they know that Luthor was the one to get someone to do it, but regardless, it kind of spurs Lois on to want to do the interview because, you know, this is just going to look even worse in this moment with a bunch of people outside. Now, Clark still thinks a rebuttal is the way to go, pointing out that Luthor has always had a surprise around every single corner. So, like, what if this, you know, just isn't simply a debate and there is another surprise coming? And yeah, he most certainly had one that I actually didn't see coming. But before I get too ahead of myself, this is when another major part of the story is tackled, when John Henry points out to Clark that he noticed that he didn't hear the brick coming until it hit the glass. So he offers to run a scan with his tech to help Clark out. So again, to connect those scenes together, when they do the scan, John Henry Irons reveals to Clark that, okay, yeah, something we already know, his body isn't healing as well as it used to, but then he said that there's a lot of damage around his cochlea, I believe it was called, with the arteries in his inner ear being a lot more narrower than what they should be. Now, for the whole season so far, everyone, including me really, has just kind of assumed that this is because of the damage he sustained in his fight with Doomsday, coupled with, you know, the fact that he has a human heart, providing this much kind of more diminished regenerative ability for him. And, you know, I was even thinking, yeah, maybe he will never get it back. But I didn't really think in this moment that it would lead to what John Henry Irons says next, because he drops that hearing loss is one of the first signs of heart disease. So this leads John Henry to say that he thinks things are only going to get much worse for Clark with having this human heart, to the point in where the muscle cells will eventually degenerate, which will eventually affect his entire body. As in, all of the powers that he has, all of his abilities, they're starting to fade. And that, okay, maybe it might not be this year or even this decade, but one day he's going to wake up and he's not going to be Superman anymore. So this storyline went in a way I thought, in one way, but in another way there was a surprise, because I thought Clark would, with this human heart, no matter where things were going and he was still flying around, I was like, I don't know though, like, is he really going to be ever back to full strength? But what I didn't expect was, you know, heart disease, never having his powers again at a certain point in time in the future. But again, as I've kept mentioning in my reviews, I really do feel like this is just the organic direction for where they're going to leave things off towards the end of the season, especially with the Superman legacy part of it, with the boys taking over. Now, also in this moment, I don't think this is really a nitpick, but I can't help myself. I was thinking, why in the living heck didn't Clark have this post-death scan at the Fortress of Solitude? Because, I mean, I think we can all agree the Kryptonian tech scan from Lara would have been able to tell him all of this information in a heartbeat. No pun intended there. But I guess for now, I'm just choosing in my headcanon to believe that perhaps there was this subconscious avoidance to Clark doing that, in a similar way, actually, to how last season Lois was initially avoiding her cancer and treatments instead of confronting it. I'm not sure, but anyway, moving on. Meanwhile, with the boys, while they're at the store, they head outside and they hear a commotion going on, and there's a bunch, and I mean a bunch of people in Smallville, having arrived to see the super family. And they all run over to them, and this is when they both kind of run away. And in this moment, I was like, yeah, you can just easily imagine now how there's going to be this Superman tour bus running around Smallville in the future, stopping off at places like the Kent farm and whatnot. Or, look, this is where Clark Kent, Superman, used to go have his coffees at the diner, or whatever else. Then, as we follow Jonathan and Jordan's scenes throughout the episode, out of nowhere, Candace breaks up with John. So as we learn more, it turns out that after Clark's interview, people have been going after Candace online and stalking her, to the point of where some comments have been pretty intense. Now, Natalie encourages him to do something about it and fight for her, and so he flies over there. And long story short, it seems that they get things back on track as best as they can, or rather that they're just going to navigate this new public Superboy life together. But back with Lex, while he's waiting for the interview to start, he looks at Amanda on the camera, and I guess he kind of starts, I don't know if I would say freaking out, but it's like a very kind of low-key, I don't quite want to call it a panic attack, but maybe. But I quite liked this moment of vulnerability that they displayed with Lex in the episode, because what the scene was really showing was how, if there's one thing we know about Lex Luthor from the comics, is that he loves being in control. And all of what's going on in this episode isn't actually his plan. And so he tells Amanda to shut it down and that there's too many variables and too many things out of his control. But Amanda refuses. And I think another subtle detail is that Lex concedes to her, because just like how he let his opportunity of being reunited with his daughter and having a life with her go to the wayside, here he concedes to going outside of his comfort zone, or what he would normally do, and trusting in someone else's plan, all because he's just too desperate to get back at Lois Lane and Superman. And so in this moment, Clark and Lois arrive to the interview, and Lex reveals on air that Superman assaulted him in Smallville. Then we also have Lois dropping the bomb of the attempted murder of Mayor Lana Lang, of which she would corroborate, and Lex is like, Mayor Lang, your friend, right? And Lois is like, Otis Grisham, your friend. So, as we could tell, all of this really is just ultimately a lot of her words against his and vice versa, up until the moment of where we did get a bit of a payoff moment, when Lex says, the difference between you and me is that when I make an accusation, I have evidence to back it up. And he plays the recording of Clark beating up Lex Luthor. Now that doesn't look good, especially with Luthor saying to Clark, if you guys remember in that fight scene, he was like denying the accusations, and I honestly didn't actually see it back then. Let me know if you did, if you thought that was being recorded. But what I also really liked is that when confronted with this evidence, if you will, Lois brings out her own surprise, having anticipated that Lex would, pull out a surprise of his own, and Lex is like, let me guess, your husband. And she's like, no, your daughter. And you just see Lex's face drop in this moment. And this is exactly what he was worried about. There's too many variables, as he said. He wanted to shut it down. This was like an absolute power move from Lois, with her revealing that his daughter would be backing this up. And, if your own daughter is willing to say that about you, even if it's lacking some evidence here and there, it would go a long way to sway some public opinion, in the same way that Lex is defaming Lois Lane in the public's eye. So since things are starting to go off plan, this is when Amanda freaks out, obviously not wanting to disappoint Luthor, guaranteeing that this would work. And she tells Milton Milton Fine to do it, which is when we finally learn what is going on here. So we cut to John Henry, and his laptop starts bugging out, and we hear this kind of, I guess, Brainiac-esque kind of voice from Milton Fine, if you even want to call it that, I guess, saying, "Hold on while I make the final preparations for you to kill Superman." So, going back to the whole Brainiac thing, I don't know if Milton Fine is going to get, like, psychic powers like he does in the comics, nor really possessed by Brainiac. I'd be pretty surprised if they go there. So, Milton Fine's Brainiac references that we've been wondering about the whole season so far could really be more like a tech support Brainiac, I suppose. And that's not me, like, crapping on this, but just being transparent with my expectations. But hey, you never know what they could do. So this is where things get pretty nuts in the episode, and I always love the thing Superman and Lois does when they cut between two very different kind of tense situations playing out, cutting back and forth. So in this moment, the suit basically kidnaps John Henry, and he's on his way to go after Clark. But also, as this is happening, the boys hear Natalie's suit coming for her as well. Now, Clark, during this point in the interview, starts hearing John Henry, but just barely, given his hearing. And this is when he, like, smashes through the window, and we get, like, a awesome Superman shot there. I guess just to avoid all of this happening in that bloody room and giving the Godfrey show even more ratings. Now, meanwhile, Jordan was looking into what the heck Natalie's suit was doing nearby, and he gets taken out by the remote-controlled suit. So this just leaves Jonathan in this moment. He manages to grab that missile, and he's a bit damaged from it, but Jordan gets back up, and they both use their heat vision combined to destroy her suit. Now, what I really loved about this tag team moment is that it really does give you a glimpse of how good they'll operate together in the world and in the future, taking their father's place. And I can only hope that we get more scenes like this in the last couple of episodes, which I'm hoping... I think they will do that, especially given the promo that we're seeing. And then as we cut back to Superman, he's having to beat the living crap out of John Henry in order to hold him off. And John Henry Irons in this moment flexes to Milton Fine that you can't beat Superman, and he just had to say it right. And this is when somehow he does these like remote upgrades to prevent the system failure to the suit, and it just disappears. And this is when Clark drops John off on the Smallville streets. So out of nowhere, really, the fight just suddenly stops, and where I thought there'd be a bit more of a battle because Milton Fine flexed the upgrade, and I thought that's when it would be happening in that fight to continue on with Superman, but he must have been on about what they're planning to do afterwards with the suit. But it does turn out that the fight was really over because, as teased in the early trailers, for those of you who remember, they wanted to take the suit for Luthor, with the very ending of this episode showing Milton Fine upgrading it into this killer suit, the Lex Luthor Warsuit, if you will. And this could get absolutely nuts given how weak Clark is getting day by day, week by week. And I mean, random theory here, I just have to say it and bring it up again. Where is Doomsday? I still choose the headcanon for now that he's just sipping a cocktail on the beach somewhere, but really, he's out there somewhere. He's just been missing this whole time, and I have to once again present that maybe, just maybe, he'll fly back in to go up against his former master who used him as a weapon and possibly save Clark from being beaten within an inch of his life by Luthor in this killer suit of his. That does seem a bit too predictable for me, but the question remains, what the heck is going to happen with Doomsday? Now, with Luthor at the end, he says that this plan almost failed as Lois was seconds away from getting Elizabeth on the air. And maybe a bit of a nitpick here, but I was just kind of thinking, why don't they just get Elizabeth to still put out a statement? That would go a long way to still discrediting her father. And if she was willing to go on call on the Godfrey show on air, you would have to think she would still agree to putting out a statement in the Smallville Gazette or something in an interview. I don't know, but if not, it just feels like something they still could have done, because Lois never obviously managed to get her on the call because of what happened with the suit situation. And then meanwhile, Amanda and Luthor kind of get it on. And then as for the very end of this episode, it leaves off a little bit feelsy, because Clark tells Lois and the boys about the tests that were run earlier, and he details how one day his heart will indeed stop working, but before then his powers will diminish. But as we know, and as I've kept saying, I'm sure the final episode will just really hammer this in, and just how the boys will have to take over. It's a big responsibility, but just this natural step for where this whole season has been going. So as for episode 8, guys, another enjoyable episode. I'm just glad that we're kind of like, this really propelled the last 2 episodes, and it kind of had to. Like, last episode, we had some interesting stuff. I mean, don't get me wrong, it had amazing moments in it. The flashbacks to Jimmy, the situation with Superman, that moment with the slow-mo bullet, it's all, like, arguably, that scene could go down in Superman and Lois, like, history for one of the best scenes. But now, like, we're kind of tackling the main plot stuff. Not that it really wasn't last episode, but you get what I mean. Like, we're back on track. Lex has stepped into the next gear. He tried doing this with Lois, discrediting her. Now he's getting his Warsuit with bloody Brainiac enhancements on it. And I think we're really in for a ride. Like, you know, they would have pulled out the stops for next week's episode, the penultimate episode, let alone the finale. Now, I don't want to get expectations up too high, but yeah, I'm choosing to believe that the last 2 episodes of the entire series will probably be, hopefully guaranteed, hopefully, really good ones. And speaking of which, as for the promo for the penultimate episode, well, let me first play it and let's get into a couple of things that I want to talk about.
You're no match for what's next. Your boys, they're in training wheels. And Lois, there's nothing she can do. I am coming after everything you have ever loved.
We need to take him out.
That is not how we do things.
Maybe it should be.
So I really enjoyed this promo, as there's a couple of things that I can definitely dig into. So initially we hear Luthor's voice saying that Superman is no match for what's next. Your boys are in training wheels, and Lois, there's nothing she can do. And I'm coming after everything you have ever loved. Likely projecting how, even though losing his daughter is something of his own making, especially recently, he's just trying to enact the same feeling that he has on Clark's family. But what really caught my eye is seeing the boys training at the fortress. Now, I'm sure this is going to provide for some fun Superboy action and scenes, and I just really loved seeing them, even a couple of scenes after this in the promo, just flying away together. Again, hoping some really cool tag team action that we got a tease of in this episode, but like going ham in the final 2. And then, in this scene, we see the suit being upgraded at Luthor's lair with Milton Fine in the background. And I also appreciate the little, I would have to say, Brainiac nods there with all of the glowing tubes. Again, highly likely being a reference to Brainiac's design at times in the comics. And then lastly, we also hear Jonathan stress to Clark that we need to take him out. But then Clark responds, that is just not how we do things, with Jonathan then saying, maybe it should be, which will probably be another subplot with just how there might be a whole, with great power comes great responsibility learning curve for the boys, despite, you know, how easy it would be in theory for them to just completely take Luthor out very quickly, and how tempting that might sometimes be for the boys, with obviously emotions coming into play just throughout their life. They're going to have to refrain from doing that if they don't want to become the very thing they swore to destroy, right? So I half expect a little bit of a storyline like that being learned, so that should be interesting. I also really hope that they get their Superboy suits before the finale. I don't want to lean too much on that, because it'll likely be in the finale when they're revealed. But, you know, at the very least, I hope they equip it very early on in the finale episode, rather than just kind of doing that final montage of scenes before the final scene rolls for the whole series, just kind of showing them unpacking it as a gift. I think it'd be really cool to actually see them wear it, maybe even for a relevant occasion, such as a saving scene, possibly even getting involved in a big bad fight. Maybe, maybe not, but that would be great. But let me know if you have any predictions there. Maybe it could just be a gift from Steel to the boys, from the DoD collaboration. I don't know. We're gonna have to wait and see. But for those of you who have seen those suits already, yeah, let's just say they look pretty awesome. But that is everything I'm gonna say in this video, guys. Been rambling quite a bit at this point, so let me know what you thought about episode 8, your favorite parts, any theories that you have. What do you think of Milton Fine and the low-key kind of tech support Brainiac thing that's going on there, the war suit that he's enhancing for Lex, and what you think that's going to do in the future? Do you think Doomsday is going to come in to help out his fellow Clark? And also any predictions for the promo for episode 9 and even the finale. But if you got this far in the video, would just greatly appreciate a like. It goes a long way to support the channel. Consider subscribing, of course, for more videos just like this. But I'm going to love you and leave you. So once again, thanks so much for supporting. I hope you guys have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you fellow Kryptonians in the next video. Goodbye.